Well, hello and a very warm welcome to today's episode of On the Spot, the 15-minute coffee break shaped conversation about all things business analysis, architecture and business change related. And I'm really pleased to say that today we're joined by David OHara of Headwind to talk about what I think is a really fascinating topic, which is emergent strategy and continuous adaptation. And I know, David, this is something you're giving a presentation on at the IRM BCT Business Change and Transformation Conference in just, well, a couple of weeks' time now, I think, isn't it, David?
2 weeks, that's right. Yeah. So I'm presenting on the afternoon of the 18th, that's right.
Yeah, scarily close now. Scary. So, yeah. So for those of you tuning in live, do remember that you can add a comment or a question to the feed. And if you do, we may well bring it up on screen. Do keep in mind that your name and LinkedIn photo will be on the recording if you do that. But always great to know what you're thinking, what your questions are. So, David, really fascinating, really broad topic. When I first saw your abstract, your conference title and abstract, one of the questions that struck me is that people say the pace of change is getting faster. It's like it's almost become a cliche. Would you say that's really true, or are we just noticing the need to change more than we have in the past?
Yeah. Well, I would say that I think the answer is yes to both. I think, the pace of change is increasing and has been, increasing progressively over the last 10, 15 years. I think what's interesting is it's not just the rate of change, but it's the scale of change as well. It's hard to have a conversation like this without talking about the pandemic, of course, and that being the massive event that I think for everyone, the sort of shock and awe factor of that in terms of the nature and suddenness of change, but also the scale of change, I think became very, very clear to people. If you look at how life in general, business, technology, etc., had all evolved over, let's say, the preceding 10 years before the pandemic came in, there were actually some, genuinely world-changing things have come along. The advent of the mobile internet, the digital business and so forth. A lot of that really fits quite comfortably into people's lives. So I think that the adoption of tech-enabled change actually was something that people were just rolling with and not noticing as much. So last year, of course, the world changed suddenly, and it's not just that it changes, but I think the other thing that people really became aware of was the scale of change. But also is that sort of interconnectedness of things. The fact that the changes that happened systemically. So I think yes to both, but also people are aware that it's complicated, as they say.
Complicated. And I remember, David, hearing because it's interesting. We always, or certainly it's always felt to me like we're at this really fast changing technical pinnacle of history. And I remember reading that the Victorians thought the same because of things like the telegraph, the telegraph or whatever. And I remember reading this historical story about the first, in the olden days, if you were a robber and you could get on a train, nothing could outrun you, so you could get away. And there's this historic case where someone sent a message to a station and the person was arrested. So you sort of think actually that kind of innovation, I suppose, has been happening.
Yeah. And your perception of change, of course, is relative to what you've experienced before. So it's I take your point, but I like the anecdote as well.
Yeah. So you've got all of that sort of playing in. So really, really interesting. So I suppose that the emergent strategy often, I suppose, to me at least, it can be read to imply a medium or long-term view. Yet, if there's this need to adapt, how does that differ from other views of strategies that are out there?
Sure. Yeah. Well, I think first and foremost, emergent strategy is just founded in the acceptance that things will change. So this idea that we can plan very, very far forward and be fixed in how we go about acting on those plans, I think that's something that people have clearly seen cannot really survive contact with the real world. So emergent strategy basically means we can be fixed on what we want to accomplish as goals and objectives in the mid to long term, but we need to allow for some of those courses of action and some of the details to emerge through discovery, basically. So it's about saying, I know what I want to accomplish. I can define broad courses of action to get me there and be very confident about the results of my actions in the short term or short to mid-term, but I need to allow for some discovery so that the right courses of action emerge in the mid to long term.
So it's about having that goal, having that destination, but the flexibility to understand that things are going to change. So not setting stuff in stone, not creating unnecessary rigidity.
Not unnecessary rigidity. That's absolutely right. So the way in which people have, traditionally gone about this sort of strategy to execution is, I'll spend some time deliberating on my strategy, and it will no doubt be very, very well thought through. I'll construct a target operating model. I'll construct a program of work. I'll commit myself to that. I'll commit resources to that. I'll commit money to that, and I'll commit to it over years. Now, the challenge is that the longer you go along that timeline, the less valid the underpinning assumptions for that program of work are. So, it seems unlikely that you're going to, make strategic decisions today, and 3 years down the line, all of the outcomes that you're going to realize are going to be exactly in line with what those originating assumptions were. So, the emergence basically allows for that course correcting as you go, whilst being fixed on what the end goal is.
Yeah, fantastic. And I suppose, again, you're in the opening, you mentioned about the pandemic. I suppose the pandemic's a really recent example of throwing everything off course, because who had that in their 5-year plan? I mean, probably
exactly. And so now that we're sort of emerging out of it, it's like, now what? We've been hearing the phrase new normal literally since the first day of lockdown, and the fascinating thing about that is, of course, no one knows what the new normal or new normals are going to be. And so I think the reality is that whatever those sort of new standards and new patterns are going to be, they're going to emerge. So we have to have a means of meeting that head on, intentionally. So, being pretty fixed on the things that we need to accomplish, but being highly adaptive about how we move forward.
Yeah, almost like purposeful adaptivity. So having that goal, but having the conscious. The conscious changes. So Walter here says, or adds a comment, that competition and customer demand has changed, so change is the new norm, which I think is a really interesting and great way.
Yeah, and there's the new norm, whatever exactly it's going to be. I think Walter is absolutely right that the reality of continuing change, ongoing change, unpredictability out in the sort of the wider business environment, I think is just going to be accepted as a fact of life. So, we need the toolkit to work with that. But I think moreover, really, we need the sort of frame of mind to work with it. So, now that the world is starting to get back to work, no one wants to default back into the old patterns. The big challenge with a lot of strategy to execution stuff is that there are defaults that drive assumptions that in turn drive behavior. And I think what we're looking to do, what Headwind sort of exists to do, is to challenge some of those default assumptions and change the way people think about the strategic change.
Yeah, which actually nicely brings in a comment that Martin has just submitted here. And Martin says, how have you seen values and strategy alignment impact the need for more or less change? And that's a big question, a really good but a really big question. I wonder whether you've got any thoughts about that, David.
Yeah. Well, I mean, if Martin could type up a little bit of elaboration on what he means by value, but the strategy alignment, absolutely drives the need for more change. When we think back to the lesson that we learned with the pandemic, when I talked about the interconnectedness of things. So we all got taught really, really clearly that every organization, every business, everything that we are a part of exists as part of a system, and that system is dynamic and is subject to change. So what we need to do is kind of design our approach to change and our approach to our businesses with an awareness of that wider business environment and how it evolves and how it changes. And things like customer needs and partner and supplier needs and so forth are all highly volatile, highly malleable things. So our strategy alignment has to first and foremost be authored with an awareness of that. Now, I'm not quite sure if that's exactly what Martin meant, but I mean, feel free to fire through another question if
Do Martin, if you're still watching, do feel free to, and if we haven't answered your question, do feel free to fire over another one. So, David, again, one thing when I was looking through your presentation, I wondered is, if we take the hypothesis, it seems a very sensible hypothesis that the future isn't certain. How does experimentation fit in with adaptation and strategy? And I mean, should we be formulating hypotheses and testing against them?
In that mid to long term planning horizon, it is absolutely fundamental, and this is one of the defaults that we want to change, because the hypothesis testing is a sort of a skill set that we all need to adapt in order to do this, emergence and discovery. So in other words, I need to find out what's likely to work and what's likely not to work as a course of action in the mid to long term. So that means experimentation, basically applying the scientific method, make a hypothesis, test the hypothesis, measure the results, act accordingly. So what that also means is that for a lot of businesses now, we need to be willing to put some resource and effort and time and thinking and some money into being able to drive this sort of hypothesis testing approach. So if I do a test and the test results are not what I expected, that is not a failure, right? I learned something about what might not work. And that's a fundamental part of how we need to be planning. So hypothesis testing and breaking this perception that there's the risk of failure. It's about finding out what won't work and finding out what will work in order to map out those long-term courses of action.
Yeah, which again, it's really interesting, isn't it, David? Because as you were speaking there, I was thinking it's like the opposite of those projects that become so big they can't fail. So they inevitably do. But no one will admit it, because to admit it would be a political nightmare, internal big P or little p. So it's perhaps actually arguably a more transparent, a more open, a fairer way of actually progressing change, a more honest way.
I think it is. Yeah, I think it is. And it has to be married with this principle of adaptation as well, because on the one hand, we're trying to map out our longer term courses of action. And, the further we look out at the future, the less certainty we have about our predictability of outcomes. What we then need to be able to do is, all of our decisions are made in the now, right? But they're made with an appreciation of what might happen next and what might happen later. So we need to be very good also observing the outcomes of projects in the short to midterm and feeding that back in. So you've got this long range, hypothesis testing, sort of experimentation and discovery approach that's mapping out those broad courses of action. And in the short to midterm, you have to be learning through doing and piping that back into your planning process as well. So basically, a couple of things happen. One is that you're planning short, mid, and long term simultaneously, or in a coordinated way. Yeah. And the other is, because of that, you can't do this once a year, set it in train, and come back next year when you can get more budget and do it again. It has to be an ongoing, living, breathing thing. So this idea that we have a strategic roadmap, yes, indeed we do. But that's a living document. Like any living thing, it needs to be looked after and nurtured and fed and watered. Yeah. I suppose a bit of a simplistic analogy, but it's like if you're driving a car, you don't say, okay, well, I'm going to drive on the A3 now, so I'll close my eyes for 20 miles. Like, you could, but it probably wouldn't be a very good idea. So Martin's got back to us. Martin says, apologies for the vagueness. No apologies necessary, of course. But by values, I mean our company values and being clear on our purpose. So yes, that makes sense. Absolutely. So anchoring everything. We talk about core model, which is kind of analogous to core purpose. It's your fundamental why. Why do I exist? What is it that I do that's in line with that purpose and for whom? And so everything you do has to be anchored back to that. And that in turn has to be informed by how your business exists in relation to that wider business system. So I absolutely, fundamental about core purpose.
Fantastic. So we're reaching the end of our time. These are always so unforgivingly short, these conversations, David, but if you had a biggest tip or takeaway for those people tuning in or watching the recording, what would that be?
It's the tools and the equipment to work in this emergent strategy, continuous adaptation way are all things that we have right now. This isn't about learning a sophisticated new methodology or buying into a belief system. It's just about trying to break some of those defaults about assumptions that are then carried through into the long term. Being much more iterative, being much more adaptive, and keeping that idea of planning, to observed outcomes, to replanning short and midterm, keeping that ongoing. Just keep it going. It has to be a live thing.
Yeah, a live, organic, living, breathing, as you said, type of thing. So finally, David, I'm sure people that are tuned in or people who are watching the recording will want to find out more about what you do, how they can connect with you, how they can get in touch with Headwind. How can people get in touch?
So, I mean, first and foremost, I'm sure my details are linked in the post. People are very welcome to connect with me through LinkedIn. We run webinars on a fairly regular basis, so please follow Headwind through LinkedIn, and you'll find out about our webinars. And for those who are interested or who can, there's as you mentioned, the IRM Business Change and Transformation Conference that's being run in less than 2 weeks' time now. So I'll be presenting on the afternoon of the 18th at that.
Yeah, I've got written down here at 2:45, and of course your session is emergent strategy and continuous adaptation. So, well, fantastic. Well, David, thank you so much for taking time out to have a conversation.
Thank you.
And great, and also thank you to everyone who has tuned in live, or indeed if you're watching the recording. And just a reminder that there is you can check out more previous episodes at onthespot.today. So there's transcripts and previous recordings there as well. But for now, thank you again, David. Thank you everyone for tuning in, and see you next time.
Cheerio.